Hello and welcome. Coming up next is the first of a very special two-part adventure in which I look at the crash of the heavenly body B-17 bomber that came down off the coast of Canvey Island. This first part charts the course, and in the second part we go into the paranormal side of it. Thanks very much for watching. I am Adam and this is Southend Guy Paranormal. 19th of June 1944, the 379 bomber group was returning to Kimbolton after attacking V1 flying bomb sites in Zidasc's Enguin area of France. Aircraft 44-6133, flown by Lieutenant A.J. Ramasili, was in trouble. It was reported making a loud whining noise. Lieutenant Lloyd Burns, pilot of the Heavenly Body 2, now takes up the story. As we let down over the Thames estuary, we encountered a layer of clouds, losing sight of the horizon but able to see aircraft immediately adjacent. By the time I realised that Lieutenant Kaufman was having trouble with this, he was already having to overcorrect somewhat, having overshot our position on the lead plane. Burns to top seats with his co-pilot Kaufman to give him a chance at flying in the left-hand seat. Lieutenant Fred Kaufman was expecting to get his own cruise soon and eagerly accepted the offer. He continues, I remember reaching over above Lieutenant Kaufman trying to push back the curtain to locate our left wingman, Ramasiti. Then the crash right into Fred, the tremendous grinding of metal, the roaring of the wind and the engines. I looked over at Sergeant Gibbs, who was standing behind us. He was as pale as death, but okay. I jerked my thumb at him indicating get out. No one needed to be told that, of course, and Gibbs disappeared. I shook Kaufman, but no response. I reached under my seat for the chest pack. It was gone. Apparently the collision had dislodged it. I unbuckled my seatbelt and climbed down toward the hatch under the pilot's seat. The plane was going down, making progress difficult. I was looking for my parachute without success. Suddenly, someone, I don't know who, maybe an angel, shoved one into my arms. My chute harness was completely unbuckled, so I buckled one leg and one buckle of the chute to one buckle of the chest harness. As the men inside struggled to abandon the aircraft, observers from the ground watched spellbound. Eyewitness C.T. Ellison recalls the collision. One of them broke up with the wings and the fuselage dropping into the water. The crew bailed out. The other plane seemed to be okay, except that one engine was on fire. Mr. D. Ball, who was 16 at the time, was cycling along Marine Parade when the aircraft approached from Kent. He had heard the whining from one of the aircraft's engines and suddenly one B-17 flew straight into the other. Both airplanes locked together for an instant and then broke apart, one falling near Canvey. Mr. Ball saw at least one parachutist. Mrs. C.L. Evans was on Lee Cliffs and saw the formation approach towards Lee Station. Suddenly, one ship veered sideways and collided with the other ship. One dived away while the other flew around before seeming to attempt and landing on the mud flats, finally plunging in with a splash. As the aircraft circled, the first parachutes appeared. Lloyd Burns takes up his story. At this point, I saw that several of the crew were trying to get the hatch door open and could not. Not being completely buckled, I was not prepared to exit yet, but threw my weight against the door trying to break it loose. Apparently it gave way because the next thing I knew I was floating down, dangling half out of my harness. Blood streamed down my face from a cut above my right eye. I must have struck something as I fell out of the plane, knocking me unconscious. I don't recall pulling the ripcord. I was hanging halfway out of the partially buckled harness, so I tried to secure myself into it better, which resulted in a very frightening sway, so I just stopped trying and held on. I looked up and saw that one main shroud line was hooked to my harness. I then looked down and began to worry about where I was going to land. I saw that I would be far from shore and I was not wearing my Mae West. The stupidity of youth. Chute harness unbuckled, Mae West off, for comfort of course. After all, the mission was over. I hit the water hard and had trouble freeing myself from the chute harness. The wind dragged me for quite a distance, but finally the chute collapsed and I freed myself after sinking pretty deep trying to get out of my heavy sheepskin jacket, pants and boots. I began treading water in my underwear. The Flying Fortress was well known as a stable aircraft, and fortunately for the crew of the Heavenly Body too, it descended in a flat circle. Many crews were trapped in their crashing aircraft as they spun earthwards. Some of the witnesses on the ground felt that the aircraft was being controlled during this descent, but this appears not to be the case. Dick Andrews' waist gunner had swapped positions with Louis Short and was flying tail gunner as he recalls. The plane flying left wing seemed to be having difficulty maintaining good position in flight, and we all sort of had an eye out for the usual flight attitude. Recalling a bit of humour just prior to the crash, Lloyd's home state of Georgia is known as the Peach State, and New Jersey, in my opinion, probably raises the best peaches. We were debating this issue at the moment of collision. We were hit on the top, which rendered our controls useless, as the control cables all pass right down the top centre of the fuselage. There was no alarm sounded to bail out. We just knew that the moment had come to get out. I attempted to jettison the escape hatch, but I could not pull the pins free. I turned the latch knob and pushed the door open against the slipstream. As I pulled myself through the narrow opening, knowing our position, I chose to open my chute immediately after clearing other planes in formation. I can remember vividly falling through the air on my back and looking up at the formation heading home and seeing two open slots where we should have been. My chute was a Pioneer backpack which had a long whip cord and required a hard pull to open. I don't know how difficult it was to open until I tried. The opening of the chute was a severe shock which I felt for some time. As high in the air as I was, I had time to look around and to thank God. I was able to look down and count the other chutes well below me and wonder whether the 7 I counted belonged to my crew or the other plane. I saw one of the faults circling in apparently stable flight, well trimmed. The plane hit the ground heading roughly easterly and narrowly missing an oil storage tank before blowing up. I believe that I was the only person to actually land on the ground. The others fell in the water some distance away. I don't know if the exact spot would be visible today. There was a high stone seawall built with large rocks which protected the shoreline. Where I landed was in 3 feet of slimy black stinky mud. My chute did not collapse immediately but dragged me along for some distance before snagging and spilling in the air. In the meantime, my flight suit scooped up the mud and filled it full. I smoothed my hair back, which ultimately dried into a hard shell. I climbed the seawall and could see a small village off in the distance, I presume about 2 or 3 kilometres. I hiked off to find help. The people who met me were very friendly and warm, knowing what had just happened. One woman invited me into her home and said she wished she could offer me a bath, but they had no bathtub. Several other women brought me food, which was in short supply, but they were very generous. I asked for help in getting information about the rest of my crew. Someone summoned a local bobby who offered to help. He took me to his home, where his wife gave me some fresh cherries while he was arranging transportation to an RAF mosquito bomber base somewhere to the south of the Thames River. On arriving there, I went to the tower for information about the accident. They hadn't received word of any rescue at that time. I was given quarters in a lovely, large stone home that was being used by the RAF officers. There I was able to bath and had a good meal with the pilots. Later that evening, I heard that most of the crew had been picked up by Air Sea Rescue and were in the hospital for the night. They did not have the names of those rescued, so I still had to wonder. The next day, a young woman pilot flew me to a Spitfire base I thought was Gravesend. There I met the other survivors from my crew and the bombardier from the other plane, the only survivor from that crew. We were picked up by a fault from our home field at Kimbolton. 2 days later, we started flying the balance of our missions. I flew my 30 missions between April and July 1944. Jack Gray Our bombardier had officially completed his tours of operations on a sortie earlier that day. He was still ordered to go on an afternoon mission by the Group Operations Officer, Jack recalls. After we made our bomb run, it was like a cakewalk because there was no flak or fighters as we headed back across the channel. The group leader, instead of beginning our letdown as we left the French coast, maintained altitude until we were over the English coast. As we started letting down through a thick, higher level of clouds, I was relaxing with my feet propped up on the bomb site. At approximately 19,000 feet, we were hit by our left wingman on their first combat sortie. Possibly he lost sight of us in the clouds and he came down on top of us in his blind spot. The plexiglass nose cone was knocked off at impact and I found myself more out of the plane than in it. Miraculously, I stopped my fall and fought to pull myself back into the plane. My first problem was to get back inside the aircraft to get my parachute. I wasn't having much success until the plane started its nosedive and the slipstream helped push me back inside. I put on my chute and gave a questioning thumbs up to my navigator. He signalled back that he was okay. At impact, our intercom system was rendered inoperative, so we could only communicate by hand signals. We looked back towards the escape hatch only to find the pilot and Sergeant Gibbs were already crowded into the narrow space meant to accommodate only one man. The pilot was trying to push and shove Gibbs through the hatch. To have proceeded to the hatch would have only added to the chaos, and maybe no one would have gotten out. I sat on an ammo can while the navigator kept watch for our escape route to clear. Finally, Eddie, our navigator, gave the all clear sign. We exchanged silent OKs and I motioned for him to get out. He was still adjusting his chute and emphatically signalled to me to go. That was the last time I saw Eddie alive. Now comes problem number 2. I found the escape hatch still in place. It wasn't supposed to be. I guessed that the emergency release must have malfunctioned. Moving feet first in the direction of the tail of the ship, I put all of my weight against the hatch. Suddenly my progress was stopped because my chute harness had come caught on the hatch handle. My adrenaline really started to flow then because I had no idea of our altitude or how much time was left for me to get out of the plane. It was now or never. I grasped the hatchway frame and literally levered myself out of the plane. Heavenly Body 2's gradual descent was what allowed so many of us to survive. The other airplane, 44-6133, dived into the Thames, taking out all but one man with it. Finally, with smoke pouring from the starboard engine, aircraft 42-97942 took a descent angle of 45 degrees and plunged nose first into the mud. 42-97942 is Heavenly Body. Burning fiercely and creating a deep hole. Mr. Payne of Canvey recalled that when he arrived on the scene, ammunition was still exploding in the fire and one of the engines had been thrown forward and was laying in a gully on the marshes. Here Mr. R. Lehman, Payne's father-in-law-to-be, helped carry the body of one of the crew members across the marsh to the sea wall. This was Flight Officer Sadler. Tail Gunner Sergeant Louis Short, who had swapped positions with Sergeant Dick Andrews, was recovered dead in the Thames. Both received the Distinguished Flying Cross posthumously on 29th of June 1944. So next we go on to radio operator Leroy Monk of the Burns crew and his recollection of that fateful day. I remember we received a big bump and crashing sound on the top of the plane. I looked through the top window of the radio room and could see part of another B-17. My escape route was the bomb bay, but my door forward was bent by the impact, so I could not get it open. I made my way back to the waist where the ball turret gunner was trying to release the rear door, which was also stuck. I sat on the floor and began kicking on the door until it gave way. I remember the tail gunner and the waist gunner were standing behind me waiting to jump. Since I was already sitting in the doorway, I decided to jump. I tipped forward, but my rear end parachute straps held me back. When I tumbled forward with the help of the plane's spin, I went too fast and hit the tail of the plane. My chute opened and tore away 3 panels. Very, very lucky. Once I was floating down, I could see the bombardier and waist gunner descending and no one else. Also, I could see the other plane in a slow spin and saw it hit an island, and now it's coming apart piece by piece. When I landed in the channel, I found my chute tangled around my legs. I couldn't get loose and the chute was filling with water and pulling me under. My life preserver would pull me up again. The water was cold and I was getting tired. I then saw what I think was a fishing boat coming towards me, but I guess because of the white caps they didn't see me until the last second. Consequently, they broadsided me and went on. Can't say how long it was before another boat came along and it threw me about a 1-inch rope which I catch but couldn't hold on because of the slickness of the brine and my exhausted state. They also went on and I figured that I would drown, and being so exhausted I really didn't care. Some time later, I have no idea how long, I found myself choking and found that another boat was there and was pulling me out of the water with a boat hook fastened onto the collar of my jacket. They pulled me aboard, pumped me out and rolled me in a blanket. To my surprise, my engineer was sitting close by, leaning against the cabin of the ship. I must have fainted then, because the next thing I remember was my engineer and I in an English hospital where I must have slept for at least 2 days. We were flown back to Kimbolton and there discovered we had lost our co-pilot, navigator and tail gunner. I was told that only the bombardier survived from the other crew. After a 3-day pass, we finished our missions and went home. Baltoic gunner Bill Farmer tells his story as follows. This was our second mission that day. Our crew had already flown 26 missions and we found ourselves mixed in with another crew. We went back to France without incident, and as we were leaving the coast I rolled my gun turret so that the guns pointed down, and I opened the hatch and climbed out into the waste compartment. My guess is that we were about 20,000 feet when the plane off our left wing slid over us and made contact. I later learned it was the crew we had divided up with on the morning mission. Our plane started to shake and went into a dive. I grabbed my chest pack parachute and snapped it on the front and looked around for the others. Doc remained in place by his waist gun but was obviously hurt by the impact with the other plane. Leroy Monk, the radio operator, was sitting in the rear doorway with his feet hanging out as though transfixed. I motioned for him to jump. The vibrations and the wind noises were too loud. We could not be heard. He was hanging on tightly and blocking the doorway. I screamed at him to grab his parachute ring and then gave him a mighty shove. I watched as his chute hit the horizontal stabiliser and burst open. Several days later, when I met up with Monk, the first thing he did was come up to me and thank me for pushing him out of the plane. I then went back to Doc, who was not moving, so I crawled up to the doorway and positioned myself to jump. Out I went and, after counting to 10, I pulled the ripcord. Just then there was an explosion, so close that I could feel the heat and the force pushing me sideways. I floated down thinking that everything was okay. The ring was still in my hand and I thought of keeping it as a souvenir. The snap of my opening chute caused my flight boots and heated shoes to fall off, but this was not a concern because I was headed down into the water below. My training told me to unhook the chest buckle on my chute and then the leg buckles about 10 or 20 feet above the water so that I could let myself drop clear of the parachute before it could come down on top of me and tangle me up so I could not swim away. On looking down I could see no boat and the shoreline seemed several miles away. Looking down to decide when and how to judge the distance to the water was not helpful, as I soon found myself in cold water with 8 to 10 feet swells and being pulled like a sailboat by my inflated parachute and one leg strap. After changing from holding on to my arm strap and then my leg strap a few times, looking back I noticed a fishing boat coming to one side at about 90 degrees from the direction I was being blown. I assumed he would slow down and my parachute would be blown into the side of the boat and I would be pulled on board. No such luck. As the boat was crossing the path where the chute and I were travelling, the wind came out of the parachute and it started to collapse. As the boat passed by, the wind picked up and started pulling me again. It was close to the boat but not close enough so one of the men on board jumped off to grab the parachute but missed, and away I went. I watched as the boat started to turn to go back and pick up their crew member. So much for rescue at sea. With my speed slowing down and my chute collapsing, I felt the muddy bottom under my feet. My first thought was, now that I've done all this, some large fish was after me. I released my harness, and looking back to sea, I saw a rowboat with 4 men heading my way and motioned me to come to the boat. By now I was extremely cold and didn't have a clue whether I was in England or France. After 20 minutes in the water, I was totally numb and had to be dragged into the boat, which then was rowed back to the fishing boat nearby. My whole body was shaking and shivering. On deck they gave me a mug of very hot tea that was great just to hold in my cold hands. But when I tried to drink the tea, it was so hot that it blistered the roof of my mouth. The fishermen were part of a Norwegian fleet and spoke in broken English, and said that they had seen the accident and came over to help. They took me to the captain's quarters and told me to get out of my wet clothes and into his bunk. Even with 4 or 5 blankets, I could not stop shaking. The captain came in and said he could stop the shivering and handed me a bottle of scotch to nurse on until he could get me to the pier at the RAF Air Sea Rescue Station. He outfitted me with dry clothes consisting of a pair of pants, a jacket and a pair of rubber boots. The pants came up to my armpits and the swallowtail jacket touched the deck, and a huge pair of rubber boots came up above my knees. I couldn't help but notice that the captain, whose clothes I was wearing, was almost 7 feet tall. Probably half plastered, with the captain holding one arm and another seaman holding the other, I was led out on the deck to go ashore. I thanked them all, especially the seaman who jumped in the water to grab my parachute as it passed. I became aware that we were tied up to another boat and not the pier. I was greeted by a lot of other seamen as we, the 2 seamen and half-bombed Yank in formal attire, navigated towards the pier across boats that did not know how to go up and down with the boat next to it. I really suspect that I was entertainment for all the people watching the seamen trying to get the Yank on shore. At the RAF station, I was able to take a hot shower and put on some better fitting clothes. They gave me some undershorts and a hand knitted turtleneck sweater, which I still have today. Then they took me into a large room to look at 2 bodies, which I was not able to identify because of their injuries. No one would tell me how many survivors there were from the 2 airplanes. After several hours with the RAF, I was taken to an R&R place for observation. It was a large house that had been converted into a semi-hospital. I was not given any information or any agenda for my return to the 379th at Kimbolton. 3 days later, with goodbyes to my new friends, I was driven by an AAF driver back to the base. There I was brought up to date on the collision and what had happened to our crew members and the others involved. After 2 more missions on a lead crew, I completed my 30 missions. The last flight was on the 4th of July 1944. I returned soon after to the US to become a cadet in the class 45-H to become a pilot in the AAF. The wreckage of the aircraft remained on Canvey Point. Occasionally more items came to the surface with the action of the tides. Pieces were removed by souvenir hunters when recovery became popular in the late 60s and 70s. This site was easily accessible and was popular with a number of aircraft recovery groups. The Southend Historic Aircraft Society salvaged and recovered numerous artefacts from the plane that were displayed at a museum maintained by the Society until it was finally closed. There are still some members of the community there who remember how these young men died in the common cause, giving up their tomorrows so that we may have our today. The account of the fate of the Flying Fortress Heavenly Body 2 was compiled by a young Englishman who became very interested in what happened on that fateful day on the 19th of June 1944. He became obsessed with finding the surviving men. Checking through official records, he was able to find the home addresses of the men. Many of the addresses have changed, but eventually all the crew was located. Mr. Jasper then contacted each one and gave them the others' addresses. My wife and I made a trip around the country visiting each of them. We are now all in touch with each other and have made several of the 379th reunions together. If it hadn't been for Mr. Jasper, we probably would have never seen each other again. In fact, Lloyd Burns, the pilot, and Jack Gray, the bombardier, lived only a few blocks apart in Sacramento, California. I never met until after hearing from Mr. Jasper. Mr. Jasper has come to America and visited with me in New Jersey and with Bill Farmer in California while on business trips. And that basically is a story of what happened to Heavenly Body. I do hope you enjoyed this. Join us next week for the concluding part with the paranormal investigation. Thanks very much. Bye bye.